Tonight's story is a quiet one. We'll follow an old king in a stone castle above a gray sea as he looks back on a lifetime of judgments and makes one final choice: not to write the law that could wound his people forever. No battles, no shouting, just waves, stone, and a pen that never quite touches the page. So now, soften your screen, turn off the lights, settle into your pillow, and let the last decision of the old king begin. The castle had been raised on stone older than the kingdom that claimed it. Its foundations bit into the cliff like a hand refusing to let go, fingers sunk deep into the dark, salt-slick rock. From a distance, it seemed less a building and more a fragment of the earth that had decided, long ago, to stand up and watch the sea. Below, the waves came and went with a patience that mocked all banners and oaths. They unstitched the shore grain by grain, leaving no trace of yesterday's footprints except in the tired legs of those who had made them. Above, the sky changed its garments from pewter to slate to a bruised, uncertain blue, but the castle remained the same, a gray tooth in the mouth of the coast. Within its walls, the kingdom's days still followed their prescribed shapes. Fires were lit in the kitchens before dawn. Boots crossed the courtyards in steady files. Orders were given, repeated, misheard, corrected. The armorer hammered dents from steel that had seen more parade than battle. The chapel candles burned down in the rhythm of prayers that had long ago ceased to surprise heaven. And in one narrow room, high above the courtyard, the king sat beside a window that did not quite face east or west, but some quiet middle where light came not as a revelation, but as a reminder. The window itself was an old wound in the stone, tall, thin, without glass, its edges softened by centuries of wind. It did not offer a sweeping view for proclamations or grand gestures. It offered a slit of world, sea, sky, a bent piece of horizon where ships sometimes passed as dark stitches on a pale hem. The king's chair had been moved there some months before, when his body had grown honest about its limits. Once, he had strode the battlements, his cloak snapping in the wind, his hand resting lightly on the hilt that glinted at his hip. Now, the walk from bed to window left his chest tight and his knees bargaining with each step. No one had remarked upon the change. A servant had placed the chair, a cushion had been added, a small table for the cup he sometimes forgot to drink from. The gestures were practical, unremarkable, like adding kindling to the hearth. But gradually, without decree or ceremony, the center of his days slid from the hall and the council chamber to this quiet strip of stone and air. In the mornings, when the castle still smelled of damp embers and unbaked bread, he would come to the chair and lower himself with a care that had not been necessary in his youth. His hands, that had once closed around sword and scepter with the same confident weight, now found the arms of the chair and clung. Not out of fear, but out of prudence. It was no longer the kingdom that needed his steadiness. It was his own frail body. He would sit, and the room would arrange itself around him. The walls kept their cool. The flag in the courtyard below moved or did not move according to the wind's mood, and the sea far beneath worked at the cliff as if nothing above it mattered. From here, the maps did not exist. The borders that had been drawn, contested, defended for decades, were invisible under the smooth sheet of distance. There was no distinction between his lands and those of his rivals, only a broad, indifferent horizon that did not care whose coin carried which face. When he had been a younger man, this view had been a place of calculation. He had looked at the line of the sea and thought of ships, of trade, of threats that might come gliding over the water like shadows. The horizon had been a question. What will come? Now it was more of an answer. Nothing that you can stop. He listened to the sea as much as he watched it. Its voice was not a single sound, but a layered murmur. The blunt crash against the cliff, the softer hiss as water slid back over stones, the deep, almost inaudible pulse that seemed to come from inside the rock itself. It was an old voice, and it spoke a language that kings did not govern. Sometimes, when the light fell just so, he saw traces on the beach far below. The ghosts of paths, the darkening where men had walked, the smudges where carts had turned. By the time he saw them, they were already fading. A single, indifferent wave could pass over and erase the patterns, the way an inattentive hand might wipe chalk from a slate. He thought of roads, those carefully built arteries of the kingdom, paved and patrolled, stretching inland to towns that owed him taxes and prayers. On the maps in the council chamber, those roads were drawn in ink that would not bleed. Here, the only road that mattered ran up and down the shore, and the sea deleted it each evening. It comforted him more than it should have. Behind him, the room held the residue of a life spent being seen. On one wall hung the sword of his youth, polished, its edge as clean as the day it had first tasted air, and later, blood. Beside it, on a peg, was the ceremonial blade that had replaced it in later years, broad and gleaming, too heavy for actual use, designed not to cut but to impress. Both rested in their places, unused, their metal catching only the thin light that entered sideways through the window. A shield bearing the kingdom's crest leaned retired in a corner, its painted emblem dulled by time. Once, that crest had been a symbol men would die beneath. Once, his heart had quickened at the sight of it graven on banners, stamped in wax, sewn into the surcoats of the men who rode at his command. Now it was something he stepped around when the servants forgot to move it. The chamber held other relics, a faded tapestry depicting a victory that now required explanation even to those who served him. A chest that had once carried tribute, now filled with garments he no longer wore. A chair opposite his, intended for visitors who did not come as often as protocol might have demanded. The castle below him lived its own life, one he felt more by vibration than by sight. There were days when the rhythm of footsteps rose through the stones in a different pattern, more hurried, more clustered, signaling the arrival of news or the visit of a distant noble. On some mornings he could tell, from the way the courtyard echoed, that the stables were busier than usual, that horses were being saddled not for a small errand, but for a larger movement. In his earlier years, he would have risen, gone down, opened doors with the expectation that all heads would turn towards him. He would have demanded reports, given orders, shaped the day with the weight of his presence. Now, more often, he let the patterns rise and fall without interference, as a man might listen to rain on the roof and choose not to step outside. It was not that he had ceased to care. It was that caring had changed shape. It had shrunk from an iron gauntlet gripping the throat of events to a hand resting lightly on the arm of a chair, feeling the tremor of the world through the stone. There were still summonses, of course. Pages came with messages he was expected to answer, confidential notes from counselors who wished to be heard without the others listening. He received them in this room now. They bowed, delivered, retreated, leaving the air disturbed in their wake. Sometimes he read the messages at once. Sometimes he set them aside on the small table by the window, letting the sealed wax watch the sea with him for a while before breaking it. He had learned that most words could wait, and the ones that could not were rarely the ones worth hurrying for. The servants grew used to this new axis of his day. Meals appeared within reach of the chair. A heavier cloak was brought when the wind turned sharp and slid through the window like a blade. Someone thought to place a rug beneath his feet, though the stone below remained cold in a way that no fabric could negotiate with. On those days when the pain in his joints flared, when his fingers felt like old branches stiffening in frost, he sat still for longer stretches, letting the sea do the moving for him. Gulls wheeled above the water, their cries thin and insistent. Clouds traveled, ships came and went, and the tide performed its endless theft and return. The castle spoke to him in subtler ways now. The cracks in the wall had widened almost imperceptibly during his reign. He could trace them with his eye the way he traced his own veins beneath the thinning skin of his hands. The color of the stone had changed where rain had always found the same path, where sun had burned more fiercely in one corner than another. These small alterations were a kind of silent chronicle, one that did not require ink. At times, he remembered the first time he had seen this room. It had been decades earlier, when he was young, breathless with the recent shock of the crown's weight on his head. An advisor had shown him the chamber as one of many, remarking perhaps on its suitability for some use: storage, a scribe, a minor official. He had glanced through the window then, noting the view with the casual entitlement of one who believed he would have time to examine every corner of his inheritance. He had not imagined that this would be the room where his life would finally grow quiet enough for him to hear his own thoughts without the roar of expectation drowning them out. The clamor of triumphs and failures, the noise of campaigns, uprisings, alliances forged and broken, those had filled the earlier chapters of his rule. They had their place in songs and records, but they did not come here often. Here, the loudest thing was his own breathing when he had climbed the stairs too quickly. As the days folded into one another, he noticed that the line between inside and outside grew thin. The smell of salt seemed to linger even when the window was still. The damp of the fog crept into his bones with a familiarity that felt almost like company. He began to understand why old sailors spoke of the sea as if it were a living creature, patient and disinterested, holding its own counsel. There were moments, short and unannounced, when his mind stumbled back through years and saw himself not as he was, a thin man wrapped in wool, spine curved by time, but as he had been, tall on the battlements, hand raised, voice carrying without effort across the assembled troops. The memory came with such clarity that the present almost seemed the dream. This small room, this modest window, this chair that creaked when he shifted. Yet even in those remembered scenes, there had been the sea, unchanged, working at the foot of the cliff. His youth had not outrun its rhythms. His victories had not altered its course. Realizing this did not sadden him. It untied a knot he had not known he carried. He had spent so much of his life believing that the kingdom rested on his shoulders, that if he faltered, the entire structure would tilt and perhaps fall. Here, at the edge of his days, listening to the dependable erosion of rock, he entertained the notion that the kingdom might be more like the castle itself, built on something older, bearing his weight for a while, but not dependent on his continued standing. There were still visits from important men, still days when he was required to descend, to sit upon the formal throne, to let his presence pour into the room like a ritual substance. But each time he returned to the high chamber, his body loosening with relief as he eased back into the chair, he felt more keenly that the true center of his reign had shifted from the highest point of the kingdom, far above the maps and the shouting and the carved emblems of power. Rule had come to look less like a shout in the marketplace and more like a whisper addressed to the sea. And there, in that narrow room where stone met wind, the vast machinery of authority slowly folded itself into the quiet outline of an old man sitting by a window, watching the waves erase the only footprints that had ever truly been his. The room where the kingdom kept its memory was deeper in the castle, nearer the heart of the stone. It did not look out upon the sea. Its only window was a slit set high in the wall, too narrow to frame anything but a slice of colorless sky. Light entered reluctantly, as if it understood that this was not a place meant for honest illumination. Here, the air smelled of old leather and slow dust. Shelves lined the walls from floor to beams, bowed under the weight of rolled parchments and bound volumes. The bindings had once been bright, dyed in the colors of various rains, but time had drawn them all toward the same tired brown, like leaves from different trees after the first frost. In his youth, the king had rarely come here. The records had been brought to him instead, carried up to brighter rooms where he sat in chairs designed to remind everyone of their posture before him. He had seen the documents as instruments, extensions of his will, declarations, decrees, verdicts. When he finished with them, they were taken away and vanished into this room, becoming part of a background he never felt obliged to study. Now, in the later narrowness of his days, he descended to them. The steps down to the record chamber were worn in the center, hollowed by the tread of generations who had carried the kingdom's decisions on their shoulders. The stone curved subtly under his feet, as if acknowledging that men were softer than rock and would always leave some part of themselves behind. He did not make the descent alone. Beside him moved a man almost as old as the shelves themselves, the keeper of the records, whose official title no one bothered to speak because everyone knew him simply as the clerk. His back bent in a similar arc to the king's, as if their spines had been carved from the same aging branch. The clerk walked slowly, not to accommodate his sovereign, but because slow was the only pace left to him. They carried no torches. The corridor was lit by lamps set in brackets, their flame shallow, their light a series of soft islands between which the darkness pooled. When they reached the door, the clerk produced a key that looked too heavy for his fingers, and the lock surrendered with a sound like a cough. Inside, the chamber received them with the indifferent familiarity of a room that had seen many faces and found them all temporary. The first visit had been suggested by the clerk, though not in so many words. There had been a moment, weeks earlier, when the king had asked a question about a long-ago case, a quarrel over land that had once threatened to ignite half the northern marches. He had remembered the shouting, the banners, the sharp taste of anger in his throat as he forced two stubborn lords to kneel and accept his verdict. "The documents exist, sire," the clerk had said, his voice thin but steady. "If it would please you." It had not pleased him exactly, but something in the idea had taken root. Now, descending the steps once more, he understood why. The sea spoke of what time erased. This room whispered of what it preserved. The clerk lit more lamps on the wall, their flames shivering as if reluctant to show too much. Shadows sprang up behind the shelves like attendants called to invisible positions. The king's breath stirred the dust just enough to make it visible as a faint, shifting veil between him and the rows of sleeping years. A table had been prepared in the center of the room, a plain surface, scarred by use, bearing the stains of ink and wax that no amount of sanding had ever entirely erased. Beside it, a chair had been placed, sturdier than the one by the seaside window, less concerned with comfort, more with endurance. He sat slowly. The wood accepted his weight with a muted creak, as if some older occupant had just shifted his position to make room. "Begin with," he said, and then he paused, not because he did not know what he wanted, but because forming the words made the desire more real. "The early years of my reign, the heavier cases." The clerk nodded and vanished into the shelves with the unhurried efficiency of a man for whom paths through paper were as familiar as paths through fields. He moved his hands along spines and rolled edges, seeking not the newest labels, which were still bright and legible, but the older, half-faded lines of ink that marked the time when the king's signature had begun to count. One by one, the documents arrived upon the table like returning ghosts. The clerk untied faded cords, unrolled parchments whose curls had stiffened in their long sleep, and weighted the corners with small stones so they would not try to close again. At first, the king looked at them as he would have looked at any report in his youth, scanning for names he remembered, assessing the shape of the words more than their meaning. But as the clerk cleared his throat and began to read aloud, the room's air thickened. The text ceased to be abstract. It became a series of doors opening onto scenes he had not visited in years. "The matter of the western farms," the clerk intoned softly. "3rd year of your majesty's reign." The king remembered the delegation, weathered faces, hands scarred by labor, one man's cap clutched so tightly between his fingers that his knuckles had bleached. At the time, they had been a problem to solve before noon. They had complained of a lord's new tax of taking seed grain as payment instead of coin. He had listened, weighed, decided. The parchment recorded the decision in neat strokes of ink. The tax confirmed with minor concession, the petitioners ordered back to their fields. In the chamber of that earlier day, the moment had felt necessary, even righteous. The kingdom needed money. Its defenses required strengthening. He had no patience then for what he saw as small reluctances to share the burden. Now, hearing the words read back to him, he remembered something the parchment did not know. The way one woman in the delegation had hesitated before leaving, her mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again when a steward's hand touched her elbow. He had not given her another chance. "The lord in question," the clerk added quietly, "is long dead, sire." His line failed. The estate reverted to the crown 10 years ago. The king nodded, though the information did not land as it once might have. The people in the farms, the children who had gone hungry that winter, because their seed grain had been taken. No one had recorded what had become of them. The parchment told only one side of the truth, and it was the side written with his seal at the bottom. Another document, another case. The clerk's voice moved from incident to incident, his tone even without judgment. Disputes over water rights, border skirmishes resolved with fines and hostages, accusations of treason, some proven, some not. Each had, at the time, come wrapped in urgency, in the heat of lobby and threat. Now, stripped of faces and rendered into lines of ink, they seemed strangely thin, like pressed flowers whose colors had leached away, but whose outlines still suggested something once living. The king found his fingers resting on the edge of the page, not quite touching the words. The parchments had a life of their own. A slight stiffness, a faint crackle when moved, the lingering smell of the animal skin they had been before being turned into vessels for edicts. He imagined, absurdly, that if he pressed too hard, the letters might smear and free themselves from his authority. "The execution of Lord Halvar," the clerk read eventually, and the king's hand recoiled of its own accord, as if the name were a coal. He remembered that day far too well. Halvar had been a fierce man, more loyal to his own idea of honor than to the crown, But he had also been one of the few who had spoken to the young king as if to an equal instead of a symbol. When rumors of his plotting had reached court, they had done so tangled with the ambitions of those who envied him. The trial had been swift. The evidence had been sufficient, perhaps more for those who wanted his lands than those who sought justice. The document recorded the crime in cold, compact phrases. The sentence was laid out as if no other path had been possible. At the bottom, his own name appeared, written in the confident hand of a man who believed that severity was a necessary language of rule. "We quartered the estate among the claimants," the clerk murmured. "The revenues aided the treasury in the following years." And Halvar? The parchment had nothing to say about the man who had once ridden beside him through the forest, laughing at how the first snow of winter clung to their eyebrows. It did not recall the moment on the day of the execution when the condemned had raised his head and looked at him with a gaze neither pleading nor accusatory, only tired. The record remembered only the crack of the axe, the list of new landholders, the date. The clerk moved on. The cases piled. Here a rebellion punished, there a remission of taxes graciously granted after a flood. The king listened as if hearing a long poem written in a language he had once spoken fluently but now barely recognized. He caught glimpses of his younger self behind each sentence. Proud, afraid, eager to prove that he was no mere custodian of his father's policies, but a man capable of his own. The judgments that had drawn admiration at the time sounded different in this room, the ones that had gone almost unnoticed, small pardons, delays in sentence, quiet intervening on behalf of some unimportant family, glowed faintly in his memory, like coals that had refused to die in the ash. The clerk's voice began to tire. The words occasionally blurred at the edges, the lines halting as he squinted at fading ink. The lamps burned lower, their light turning more golden, more conspiratorial. Shadows grew taller on the walls, peering over the clerk's shoulders as if they too wished to read. The king felt fatigue in his back, in the place where spine and chair met, but he did not call for a halt. There was a compulsion in him now, a slow but insistent need to see more, to hear more. These were not just documents. They were the fossils of choices that had once felt sharp and immediate. A case involving a village suspected of harboring bandits slid across the table. He remembered the reports: cattle taken, a merchant killed on the road. The order he had signed had authorized the burning of 2 houses as an example. The parchment recorded that the bandit attacks had ceased afterward, as if cause and effect were that simple. The clerk's voice faltered at the description of the burning. The words were technical, but the king saw the flames with sudden clarity, the rush of heat, the twist of smoke, the way wood fell in on itself. He saw, too, a girl standing among a scattering of charred beams, her hair singed at the ends, her face turned upward toward the sky with an expression the record did not consider worthy of notation. He found himself wondering, absurdly, whether she had ever married, whether she had told her children about the day the king's order had reached her roof. "The attacks did not resume," the clerk recited. The area remained quiet in subsequent years. Quiet did not always mean at peace. He realized, slowly, that this exercise was not bringing him the reassurance he had expected. Some stubborn part of him had hoped that hearing his past decisions laid out in neat columns would confirm that, on balance, he had been just, that the necessity of those days would still be legible now, after the heat had left them. Instead, what he felt was weight, an accumulation of moments in which he had acted decisively in a world that had not been as simple as parchment made it appear. Each verdict was a stone added to a wall whose purpose he now questioned. The clerk, sensing perhaps the change in the king's posture, closed the last document with care. The parchment rolled back upon itself slowly, like a creature reluctant to sleep again. "Shall I fetch more, sire?" he asked, his voice hovering between duty and mercy. The king looked at the heap upon the table, a small mountain of resolved conflicts. Outside this room, they were history. In here, they were still raw ingredients. Pain, fear, ambition, all pressed into lines that did not admit how messy they had been. He shook his head, more from inside than with any visible movement. "Another time?" he said, though he did not know whether he wanted there to be another time or not. The clerk nodded and began laboriously to tie the rolls again, to gather them into his arms. The records did not protest. They had no preference between being read and being shelved. Only the man who had once signed them felt the echo. When the king stood, his knees complained. He rested his hand on the table for a moment, not to steady himself, but to acknowledge the presence of what lay spread upon it. Then he turned toward the door, toward the thin line of gray sky visible high in the stone. As he climbed the stairs back toward his window above the sea, the words of the document seemed to cling to his clothes, a whispering accompaniment to the rasp of his breath. The law, he thought, did what it was shaped to do: impose, restrain, order. But in doing so, it collected something else, unintentionally, a sediment of sorrow, anger, resignation. The kingdom's memory was not neutral. It weighed as much as any crown. By the time he reached his room, the light had shifted. The sea was darker now, its surface stippled by wind. He sank into his chair, and for a long time he watched the waves with the peculiar, hollow sensation of a man who has discovered that the lines he once drew so confidently on paper have, under the weight of years, become questions instead of answers. In the hush between the crash and retreat of the water below, he understood with a clarity that was more tired than sharp that every stroke of his pen had split the world in two, and the ink had never bothered to record which side his own soul had fallen on. The Hall of Council had been built to make men feel small, even those who entered it with titles like armor. Its ceiling arched high above, a stone canopy painted once with saints and victories, now dulled by smoke and time. Tall windows admitted a reluctant, strained light that fell in pale bands upon the flagstones, as if even the day outside were hesitant to intrude. At the far end, on a raised platform of 3 broad steps, the throne waited like a question carved from oak and crowned with gold leaf. It was not the most valuable object in the room, but it was the one least designed for comfort. Its back was too straight, its arms too hard, its seat too flat. It had been made not for a man, but for the idea of a man. Once he had filled it with a kind of fierce ease. He had climbed those steps as a young king, shoulders squared, the weight of the crown still strange enough to feel like a borrowed helm instead of a second skull. The hall had filled with bodies then, ambassadors, generals, petitioners, all arranged in the careful disorder that only protocol could choreograph. Their eyes had risen to him like a field of blades catching the sun. Now, on days when duty demanded, he walked toward the throne more slowly. The carpet that ran down the center of the hall cushioned his steps, but he could still feel the stone beneath through the thin soles of his shoes, an unyielding reminder. The courtiers parted as he passed, their expressions expertly controlled, mouths composed into the mixture of respect and calculation that had become their true heraldry. The hall heard many voices on those days. Some were loud, swelling to fill the spaces beneath the arches as men argued with the practiced fervor of those who understood that passion, displayed correctly, could be a tool. Others were soft, slipping between the louder statements like threads between thicker strands, binding them into something stronger or more dangerous. He listened, as king must. The topics varied: border disputes, trade arrangements, questions of succession in families whose internal knots had become too tangled for them to untie without cutting. But beneath the details of each matter, there was a deeper current now, one that carried the same unspoken urgency. Time is short. Not time in general. His time. He saw it in the way counselors leaned forward when he spoke, measuring not only his words but the steadiness of his breath. He felt it in their eagerness to conclude matters, to have them written, sealed, and set into something that would outlive him. The more his body betrayed the years, the more the hall seemed to crave ink and stone, as if fearing the instability of a future without his signature. They did not say it aloud. No one spoke of his failing strength in the place where his image was supposed to remain unblemished, but their suggestions betrayed them. Proposals came more often framed as lasting measures and final clarifications. Certain counselors pressed for reforms that would secure the realm long after he was gone, their eyes sliding away from him at that last word, as if embarrassed by their own honesty. Others sought confirmation of long-held beliefs. They wanted old enmities codified, margins drawn thicker around their privileges, grievances enshrined into prohibitions so that what they feared in their rivals could never grow teeth. To them, his mortal weakness presented not a moment for reflection, but an opportunity for permanence. It was an odd sensation to sit upon the throne and feel himself treated not as the center of power, but as a narrowing window. He could almost hear the ticking behind their rhetoric, a clock that his own heart wound down. On one particular day, the hall felt especially crowded, though the number of bodies within it did not differ greatly from the usual assembly. Envoys from the southern marches stood shoulder to shoulder with northern lords and the nervous representatives of merchant houses whose wealth had made them important but not yet familiar. They spoke of law, not the scattered case-by-case application that had governed so many years, but a desire for a single, unassailable code, a crown of words. One of the more poetic counselors called it, to sit beside the crown of gold. The phrase caught. Heads nodded. A law that would bear his name, they said in many versions. The king's code. A final ordering of the kingdom's obligations and punishments. An edifice of language to match the stone walls that ringed the city. It would mean no more ambiguity, they argued. No more competing interpretations. Everything written, numbered, defined. As they spoke, he looked past them to the windows, where the sky showed in narrow bands. The light that filtered in was thin and cold, skimming across polished armor, catching in rings, glinting on the edges of ink pots placed ready for scribes. He thought of the record room below, of the parchments that already bore his signature, each one a decision that had once seemed sufficient on its own. To bind them all into a single structure, something that could not easily be altered once his hand was no longer available, was to build a monument not only to his reign, but to his mistakes. Their voices layered upon one another, each man imagining himself as a modest architect of this future edifice. They talked of theft and treason, of the proper limits of noble power, of the rights of townsfolk and serfs. Some urged harshness. Others, out of self-interest disguised as compassion, urged leniency in select areas. All agreed on one thing: the need for clarity. He sat very still and listened to them outline their visions. They imagined a kingdom where every action had already been weighed in advance, where the living could be measured against sentences written by the dead. Order, they said, would deepen. Stability would be preserved. The realm would know what it was. He wondered if they had ever watched a child learn to walk, stumbling and correcting with each uncertain step. Law, in their mouths, sounded less like guidance and more like a chain fixed at both ends. From time to time, they turned to him, waiting for a sign, a slight inclination of the head, the crook of a finger, that would indicate his favor. In such moments, the hall held its breath. Scribes poised their quills above waiting parchment, ready to trap his decision the moment it left his lips. He responded when he must, his voice quieter than it had once been, but still carrying to the farthest pillars. He asked questions whose gentle phrasing disguised the unease beneath. Had they thought of this consequence? Had they considered that? If the law was plainer, would it truly be kinder or merely quicker? The answers came wrapped in deference, but they were blunt at their core. Men trusted what they could see. They insisted. A written code would reassure them where the shifting moods of rulers might not. He listened, knowing that they were not entirely wrong. He had once been the shifting mood that frightened them. He had once believed that decisiveness was a virtue in itself. The records downstairs had shown him otherwise. When the formal session ended and the hall emptied of its heavier figureheads, the day did not grow quieter. It simply changed register. Smaller knots of counselors formed in side chambers and corridors, in alcoves beneath staircases, in the shadow of statues whose stone eyes had seen many such gatherings. Their talk, though lowered, did not cease. Some were concerned that the king hesitated too much, that his age had loosened his grip. Others, more perceptive or perhaps more afraid, wondered whether his hesitation came not from weakness, but from seeing farther than they did. Advisors sought him in the hours between meals, requesting private audiences in the name of urgency. They came with polished arguments, pressed close to his ear in rooms much smaller and more intimate than the hall. Here, their words grew more candid. They spoke of enemies who would take advantage of any softness, of foreign powers watching for cracks in the kingdom's firmness, of heirs whose youth might not be ready to bear a kingdom without a strong framework to guide them. Each man held a different piece of fear, but together they assembled a single picture. If he did not act now, the realm would suffer later. He heard them out. He saw the shapes of their anxieties as clearly as he saw the shadows cast by their bodies on the tapestries behind them. Some feared loss of influence, some feared genuine chaos, some feared that, without a final impressive law, his reign, and by extension, their years of service under it, would be remembered as something unfinished. In all their words, there was a subtle violence, the desire to bind the future tightly enough that it could not surprise them. He allowed their advice to accumulate like snow on a roof. Each flake on its own was light, barely felt. In time, the pressure became something the beams had to answer to. At meals, he noticed how conversations bent themselves around the theme, even when no one named it. A remark about a distant lord's disobedience turned into a veiled reference to discipline. A discussion of harvest yields slid easily into talk of responsibility. It was as if the entire court were rehearsing its argument, practicing their lines before the king's final decision. There were gentler voices too, though they did not rise as often in assemblies. A judge of modest rank, his hair thin but his eyes still quick, murmured in one private moment about the danger of binding everything. A law too neat can forget the edges, he suggested, where real lives fray. A priest, older than his post might have required, spoke vaguely of mercy, of the difference between divine judgment and human attempts to mimic it on paper. Their words did not linger in the corridors the way the calls for certainty did. They were like candles snuffed quickly after being lit. The scent of smoke told him they had existed, but the darkness reclaimed their place. On some evenings after such days of listening, he would return to his chamber by the sea more exhausted than any campaign had ever made him. Battles ended with the last clash of steel, with bodies counted, with banners lifted or lowered. This siege of counsel had no obvious conclusion. There was always one more argument, one more "consider this," one more plea disguised as prudence. He would sit in his chair, letting his bones settle, and feel the echo of their voices in his skull. They reverberated, overlapping, a chorus of concern and ambition. No matter how far the sea stretched in front of him, it could not entirely drown them out. The horizon offered a different kind of advice. It insisted, simply by existing, that there were things beyond the reach of his laws. Beyond the last village, beyond the last field, beyond the last line on the map, there was water. And beyond the water, other shores he would never see. The law they wished him to write would not touch those places. It might not even touch all of his own people in the way they imagined. He thought of the burned houses, the taxed farms, the letters he had never written. He thought of the girl standing among the ashes, of Halvar's steady eyes, of the countless faces that had never found their way into the record's ink. What would happen if he now gave his blessing to a code that left no room for the possibility that he, too, had been wrong? In the hall, his title was pronounced with ceremonial weight, syllables as heavy as metal. In his chamber, by the window, the word king felt much thinner. It was a garment he wore, but inside it, he was simply a man who had been allowed to decide too much for too long. Outside, the castle's life continued in its own pattern. The scrape of buckets in the courtyard, the distant murmur from the kitchens, the occasional burst of laughter from some corner where youth had not yet learned to mute itself. The world did not wait, breath held, for his answer as intensely as the Hall of Council did, and that contrast unsettled him. On a day of heavy rain, when the sky and sea had blurred into a single sheet of gray, a group of counselors pressed him again. They framed their petition in the language of duty, of legacy. Other realms, they said, had their great codes, their collected laws. Was his kingdom to remain forever a patchwork of decrees, or would it, too, have its marble pillar of statutes? He saw how they needed it, not only for the realm, but for themselves. A fixed code would give their careers a shape, their arguments a spine. They could point to it in years to come and say, "We were part of that." He considered, not for the first time, what it meant to deny them. There was cruelty in refusal, perhaps. They were asking for security in a world that had given them little guarantee of it. But there was also cruelty in assent, if the thing he agreed to would harden every misjudgment he had ever made into precedent. The advice did not lighten as days passed. It grew heavier, more insistent, often wrapped now in words that touched upon his age. To do nothing, some hinted, was to leave his heirs in danger, to abandon them to the chaos of interpretation. A strong king, they implied without saying it directly, would not shrink from shaping the future. He heard, beneath their caution, a demand that he confirm the story they wished to tell about him, that he had ruled firmly, clearly, decisively, from first year to last. Between the press of their expectations and the pull of his own misgivings, he felt sometimes like a bridge under too much load. The stone that had seemed so solid when he first took the throne now creaked in ways only he could hear. On one of the colder evenings, when the wind slipped through the window as if it too were searching for some place to be heard, he looked at the sea and thought of walls. They were, at heart, the same thing men loved to build, whether from rock or from words. Both promised safety, and both hid, in their very nature, the potential to imprison. In the Hall of Council, his counselors were busy drafting the outlines of a great wall of law, eager to see its mortar set before his hands could no longer bless it. On the cliff beneath his chamber, the sea continued to work at the only wall it recognized, patient as an old faith. He closed his eyes and listened to the distant, endless impact of water on stone. Their advice, however fervent, had not yet found a way to echo down into that sound. It was in that slow clash between voices seeking certainty and waves that erased everything without preference that he began to understand that his greatest act of rule might not be another stroke of the pen at all, but the deliberate withholding of it. And in the days that followed, as the pressure in the hall intensified and the weight of their counsel pressed upon his chest like an invisible armor he had not chosen to wear, the thought stayed with him, quiet and persistent, like a tide rising in the dark. Dawn did not so much arrive at the castle as seep into it, pale and hesitant, like water finding its way through old mortar. The sky outside the high windows went from ink to ash without ever quite turning rose. The sea below traded its darkness for a dull metallic sheen, as if someone had laid a sheet of beaten pewter over the world. On most mornings, the king greeted this light from his chair by the window, watching it climb the cliff and brush the battlements in thin, slanting strokes. The day announced itself there with gulls and the distant clatter of buckets. But on this morning, his path turned inward instead of outward. The corridor to the small writing chamber was quiet at that hour. Servants had not yet fully filled it with errands and whispers. It smelled faintly of cold stone and the ghost of last night's smoke. He walked slowly, not because of indecision, but because his body now demanded that even conviction move at a measured pace. The chamber itself was not large. It had no tapestries, no heraldic clutter, no emblems carved to remind anyone of anything. Its walls were plain, its floor bare. A single window, smaller than the one that faced the sea, let in a narrow blade of dawn that fell directly across the central object in the room, a table. The table was old, and had been old even when his father sat where he now stood. Its surface bore the history of hands and decisions, grooves left by impatient quills, circles of darker grain where ink had spilled and been wiped away imperfectly, faint scars where a seal had been pressed too hard. It had held decrees calling men to arms, treaties that had ended wars, grants of land that had rearranged loyalties as if moving stones in a wall. Today, the table held nothing but a sheet of parchment and a pen resting in an inkstand. The parchment lay flat, perfectly centered, its whiteness almost startling against the bruised tones of wood and stone. It had been cut from a fine skin, smooth and even, with no obvious flaws. It waited with the unknowable patience of inanimate things, free of anticipation, incapable of dread. He came to stand before it, and felt, absurdly, like a man arriving late to a meeting with himself. Someone, one of the stewards, likely under the direction of some counselor, had arranged the scene with a certain ceremony. The ink had been freshly ground. Its surface still held the soft, viscous shine of readiness. The pen was one he knew well, balanced to his grip, its nib trimmed to the exact width that made his hand look decisive on the page. A candle burned nearby, though the dawn made it unnecessary, as if to suggest that even light should assist in this act. No instruction accompanied the arrangement. none was needed. The blank sheet and the waiting pen together constituted a question as loud as any shouted in the council hall. "What will you write?" He lowered himself into the chair with care, the wood creaking softly in answer. The room breathed around him, stone exhaling the night's collected chill. He put his hands on the table, not yet touching the pen, and looked at the parchment as a man might regard a calm, shallow pool whose depth he suspects to be deceptive. It was not that he imagined he would draft the whole of the great code they desired in this single sitting. Even his most anxious counselors knew better than to expect that. But the first stroke, the first heading, the first word, would be an opening of the gate. Once ink marked this page in that direction, others would pour through. Scribes would multiply his lines. Jurists would hang interpretations on them like weights on a scale. What began here, quiet and solitary, would echo in places he would never see. His fingers moved slightly, the skin along his knuckles tightening. For a moment, he saw as clearly as if it lay already before him what they wished from him, a title, bold and final, something that generations could point to. The code of, and then his name. It would look handsome on the first page. It would fit neatly in the mouths of men who like to memorize such things. The temptation was not only theirs. There was a part of him, small perhaps, but not silent, that felt the pull of that imagined certainty, to leave behind a single definitive shape instead of a scatter of decisions, to be remembered not as a series of reactions, but as an architect. It would be a kind of answer to the long, messy argument his reign had been. He thought of kings whose names had clung to such creations long after their faces and voices had dissolved into legend. He had invoked some of them in his youth, consciously or not, when justifying his own severity. To join their company in the memory of law would be to claim a certain immortality. The thought hovered, then thinned under the pressure of another image, the record room, its shelves bending under the weight of decisions already made. Those parchments had not felt like a monument. They had felt like stones in a wall built hastily in storms, some placed where they fit least badly rather than where they truly belonged. He reached for the pen. It fit into his hand with the intimacy of a familiar tool. His fingers closed around it carefully. The joints, swollen by age, made the grip less firm than it had once been. When he dipped the nib into the ink, the liquid embraced it in silence, a dark, smooth welcome. Lifting it again, he held the pen above the parchment, angled to begin. The first obligation of a king, he had been told as a boy, was to decide. Not to feel, not to brood, not to hesitate, but to choose. His father's voice, though long stilled, came back to him in the form of a memory engraved not in sound, but in the posture of a man at a desk, writing quickly, barely pausing between lines. Indecision, his father had believed, invited contempt and disaster in equal measure. He had lived by that belief for many years. The documents downstairs bore witness to it in stark phrases. Now poised to give this old habit its grandest expression, he found that something in his hand refused to obey his training. It was not that the pen grew heavy. It was that the air between nib and page thickened, as if filled with the unrecorded consequences of everything he had already signed. What would he write first? Theft? Murder? The obligations of vassals to their lords? Or some lofty statement about justice and order, a preface to make the iron taste of penalties go down more smoothly? He thought of the burned village and the girl standing amid the charred beams. To her, the law had arrived not as a principle, but as heat and smoke. No preface had preceded the crack of timbers, No careful numbering of statutes had framed the moment when her roof departed from her rafters. He thought of Halvar's eyes, of the farmer's hands, of all the small lives that had been turned by a few lines of ink. To gather all such power into a single, polished structure was to give his younger self, and all those like him yet to come, a sharper blade. The nib wavered. He considered another tactic. Perhaps the code, if he must begin it, could be written more softly. Perhaps he might inscribe not punishments, but protections, not obligations, but safeguards. A law that bound not only the governed, but the governors. The idea flickered with a fragile light. A law that limited those who wielded power as much as it constrained those who endured it. That would be something new. He could, in theory, fashion phrases that made cruelty harder, that slowed the speed of condemnation. And yet, even as he imagined such merciful clauses, he knew how words could be bent. Mercy on parchment did not always mean mercy in practice. Men adept at argument would find their way around obstacles that simple folk could not step over. A code written with the gentlest of intentions could be turned, in the hands of future interpreters, into something harder than anything he could foresee. His gratitude for the clerk's readings descended now like a weight. The parade of past cases had shown him that the law's true shape was not the one drawn in chambers like this, but the one it took when it collided with fear, hunger, pride. No pen, however careful, could control that collision once it began. The room remained quiet. The candle burned with a steady, small flame. Outside, the castle's internal day began to stir. The faint thud of a door, a shouted word in a courtyard far below, the metallic cough of a bucket striking a well's stone rim. The world did not pause for his dilemma. The nib, still suspended, gathered a small, swelling bead of ink that trembled at its tip. One slight movement would send it tumbling onto the parchment, a first mark that could be shaped into any letter, any word. He became aware of his own heartbeat, of the way it seemed to push against his ribs with every thud, as if asking to be consulted. What did he owe them? Those who would live after him, who would never know his face except as a profile on a coin or a name in a list of rulers. Did he owe them certainty, even if it was a false one? Or did he owe them the space to do what he had done, badly and well? To listen to cases as they arose, to err, to correct, to learn. The counselors would say he owed them a rampart, something they could stand behind when storms came. But what if the rampart he built now collapsed on them instead? He thought of the sea again, though he could not see it from this room. Its work on the cliff was slow, but it did not need a king's permission to continue. It respected no lines drawn on paper, and yet, in its erosion, there was a kind of rough mercy. It did not single out one stone to punish more than another. It wore them all down eventually. The law they wished for would not be like that. It would fall unevenly, as laws always did, weighing heavier on those without the means to step aside. The ink at the tip of the pen stretched, then finally fell, a tiny droplet that landed near the top edge of the page. He blinked, startled by the soundless black dot. It was nothing. A flaw, easily cut away if they wished. A scribe could trim the parchment's margin, could pretend that no hesitation had ever stained it. But he knew that if he continued now, that stray mark would become, in his own mind, the true first word of the code. A question, not an answer. He set the pen down. The nib touched the rest of the ink with a small, resigned kiss. A thin streak of black trailed back into the stand. His fingers, freed, flexed slowly, stiff joints complaining as if they had been holding more than a featherweight of wood and metal. He sat back in the chair. The unmarked expanse of parchment, interrupted only by the single accidental speck, stared back at him with the blankness of snow before tracks. It would be so easy to call for someone now, a scribe, a counselor, any of the men eager to turn his smallest sign into a cascade of clauses. They would be delighted to see the page, even with its blot. They would read into the presence of ink what they wished to see, the beginning. Instead, he remained alone. The room's simplicity, which had once seemed merely practical, took on a new quality. Without tapestries or carved saints to mediate his thoughts, there was only stone, wood, parchment, and breath. This was the naked place behind the throne, the quiet engine room of rule, stripped of the trappings that had so long made him forget how bare it truly was. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and allowed himself to imagine, with deliberate clarity, the future they wanted. A code bearing his name, cited decades hence by men who had never seen the hesitation in his hand. Children punished according to its articles, disputes settled with its numbers, judges invoking the wisdom of the late king, without ever knowing how much of that wisdom was born of doubt rather than certainty. He imagined, too, another future, more chaotic at the edges perhaps, where no such code existed. His tired, scattered decrees would remain what they were, fragments subject to revision, argument, forgetting. His heirs would have to judge each case as it came, as he had done. They would make their own mistakes. They would also have their own chances to be better. Which of these futures was kinder? Which was more honest? He realized, with a slow, almost painful clarity, that the decision would not belong only to him. He could start the code, but he could not finish it. Even if he lived to sign the last of its pages, others would amend it, twist it, use it as justification for things he would not recognize. His name would be a cloak they wore while doing their own work. To begin such a thing now, at the end of his life, was to hand a tool to strangers and hope they would wield it gently. Everything he had learned argued that hope was too fragile a foundation for such weight. His hand reached, not for the pen, but for the parchment itself. He slid it a little farther from him, away from the center of the table, so that the blade of dawn light now fell not on its surface, but on the grain of the wood, where no word would be written. The small, accidental ink spot remained a solitary mark in the dimmer zone, inconsequential and yet stubbornly visible. He did not ring the bell that would summon anyone. He did not call out. He simply sat and let the moment pass from possibility into something else. Time moved, even in that still room. The candle guttered as a draft found it, the flame bending briefly before straightening again. The sky in the high window lightened by a shade. Somewhere in the castle, a door closed with the soft finality of a decision completed. When at last he rose, his knees gave a familiar protest. He placed his palm flat on the table, feeling the coolness of the wood, the small ridges and depressions worn by countless predecessors. Not one of them, he knew, had imagined this exact pause. Each had believed, as he once had, that their duty was to fill the blank. He left the parchment where it lay. In the corridor, the first murmurs of the day's business reached him. A servant's laugh abruptly stifled, the brisk exchange of instructions, the clinking of something metallic being carried past. The castle was waking into the shape it knew, unaware that in the small room behind the walls of authority, something had quietly refused to be born. He did not return immediately to his window by the sea. Instead, he walked the long way, through a gallery where old portraits hung in dim rows. Faces of those who had sat where he sat looked out from cracked varnish, their expressions fixed in whatever dignity the painter had imposed on them. Some were stern, some bland, some almost kind. All were certain. None of them, he suspected, had ever been painted in the act of not signing something. There would be no portrait of him in that small writing chamber, pen hovering above a blank page. No chronicle would record the morning on which he chose not to lend his name to a monument of law. At most, a future reader of some dry account might note the absence of a great code in his reign and interpret it as failure or sloth. He walked past them all, their eyes following in the way painted eyes do, and felt an unexpected lightness in his chest. Not joy, his years did not permit such extravagance, but an easing as if one invisible chain among many had quietly loosened. When he regained his seat by the sea, the tide had risen. The line where water met cliff was closer, the waves striking with more force, sending up occasional plumes of spray that caught the pale light and then fell back, unremembered. The horizon, as always, refused commentary. From this height, no one could have guessed that a blank sheet of parchment lay on a table in a small room only a few corridors away. The decision not to mark it had left no visible trace on the landscape. Ships would still sail, markets would still open, the village hearths would still be lit. Yet he knew in the marrow of his thinning bones, that something had been averted. Not a catastrophe that could be named and counted, but a hardening of the world in a shape that would have left less room for the small, stubborn, imperfect mercies that ordinary people extended to one another in the shadows of official proclamations. He watched the waves erase and redraw the seam of the shore in their ancient, indifferent rhythm. Between one crash and the next, he let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. In a reign marked by countless orders, the most honest line he had ever inscribed upon the kingdom was the one he had just refused to write. The news of a king's waning strength is one of those things that travels without ever needing to be spoken plainly. It moved through the castle the way damp moved through stone, slow, inevitable, seeping into places where no one had intended it to go. Servants did not discuss it in words of illness or decline. They spoke instead of how often the old king now asked for his thicker cloak, how the tray from his meals returned with more untouched, how sometimes he dozed in his chair by the window with his head bowed, as if listening more closely to something only he could hear. In the hall of council, the awareness took a different shape. Men who had once argued with expansive gestures now weighed their movements when he entered, measuring whether their passion might tire him. Others, more anxious, spoke faster, as if they could compress their hopes and plans into the shrinking pockets of his attention. The great code, the crown of words they had imagined, still hovered on their tongues, but they named it with less certainty now, wary of sounding as if they wished to hurry him into the grave that would make their own designs easier. Whispers of that morning in the writing chamber did not circulate. No one knew of the blank parchment except those who had set the table and found later that nothing had been written. They assumed reasonably that the king intended to dictate instead, or that some other document had occupied his time. Blankness in their minds was a pause, not a conclusion. The parchment was removed with the quiet efficiency that was the castle's instinct. Folded, set aside, replaced with other tasks. No complaint, no remark. Only absence, which is seldom news. The king returned to his narrow room above the sea and allowed the days to shorten around him. Autumn came with a subtle change in the sea's color, a deepening from metallic gray to something heavier, like lead stirred by a slow hand. The air thinned, sharpening along the edges of the wind, slipping through the window with a persistence that turned breath into a small plume with each exhale. He wore more layers now, wool over linen, fur-lined mantle over wool. Yet there were moments when cold seemed to ignore cloth and go straight for bone. His fingers, which had once held reins and weapons as if they were extensions of his own will, now struggled sometimes with the simple act of closing around the arms of the chair. Pain, when it came, had a different flavor than the pains of youth. It did not blaze up and vanish. It settled, a steady weight in joints and chest, a soft stone placed on his rib cage that made certain movements feel like petitions submitted to an unseen tribunal. Physicians attended him, of course. They brought decoctions whose bitterness outlasted their effects, compresses that left his skin smelling of herbs and old cloth. They advised rest, as if his days were still something he could spend quickly or save. They spoke to him gently. Yet when they stood in corners conferring, their faces betrayed the knowledge that medicine could do little about the simple fact that a life was reaching the far edge of its map. He did not resent them for their helplessness. He had learned, over long years, that most expertise, including his own, was a careful arrangement of useful illusions over a core of ignorance. Visits came and went. Some were formal, ambassadors paying their respects in longer, more elaborate phrases than they would have used a decade earlier, conscious that their words might be the last to be recorded as addressed to him. Others were personal, though few dared to let such meetings drift too far from protocol. A son, perhaps, his own shoulders already bending beneath lesser versions of the same weight. A distant cousin, a childhood companion elevated to some minor office along the way. They brought memories like offerings and left with a politeness that tried not to look like farewell. The counsel about the code did not entirely cease, but it softened. The counselors began to speak of drafts to be completed in the next reign, of committees, of commissions. The urgency that had once driven their proposals ebbed into a more general and abstract concern. They had begun, instinctively, to reorient their expectations toward someone else. He watched this shift with a detachment that surprised him. There would be another king after him, someone who would inherit not only the throne and the crown, but also the unfinished hopes and fears of the men who had served under his rule. That successor would be urged toward action, toward the writing of something that he himself had left unwritten. Perhaps he would succumb. Perhaps he would resist. Either way, the kingdom would go on negotiating the distance between what it wished to fix and what refused to hold still. The sea, indifferent to succession, kept its own counsel. As his body yielded more often to fatigue, the hours he spent at the window blurred at their edges. There were days when he could not remember later whether he had truly watched a ship's slow progress along the horizon or merely dreamed it. The line between waking and sleeping thinned like old cloth at the knees. He found that his mind returned, again and again, to small, less impressive moments of his reign. A market he had once passed through in disguise as a younger man, just to feel the press of ordinary life. The sound of a baby crying somewhere in a crowd gathered for a proclamation. The sight of a farmer quietly stepping between two neighbors mid-argument to pour them each a cup of watered wine. None of these scenes had ever been written down. They had left no parchment shells in the record room. Yet they seemed now to cling more stubbornly to his memory than the ceremonies that had been painted and sung about at the time. If he had been a different sort of man, given to regrets that sought words, he might have tried to gather these fragments into some confession. Instead, they remained what they had always been: images, sensations, the texture of a life that had been too large to be truly understood by the one living it. he made one more descent to the record room. The clerk, now as frail as the papers he tended, received him with the same small bow as before, though it took more effort to straighten afterward. The lamps were lit. The shelves watched. This time, the king did not ask for a particular era or type of case. He simply sat and allowed the clerk to choose. The documents that unfolded on the table that day were not the heavier ones. There were fewer executions, fewer treasons, more of the small knots that had needed untying. Arguments over boundaries between fields, questions of inheritance in families where no child had been born, disputes over the right to collect tolls at a bridge that had washed away twice and been rebuilt with everyone's reluctant contributions. The clerk's voice rasped over the names, so many names. Listening, the king had the sensation of hearing the kingdom breathe, shallowly in some places, deeply in others, with occasional catches when illness or hunger had struck. Each case had once seemed urgent to those involved. Now they were lines in a room where dust and quiet ruled. He realized, at some point, that he no longer needed to see his own signature at the bottom to know which decisions had been his and which had not. The tone of the decrees, the balance between demand and concession, the choice of phrases, these betrayed him more clearly than the formal scrawl of his name. He could tell when he had been young, impatient, eager to show strength. He could sense where age had allowed him to bend without feeling broken. The clerk paused to wet his lips. The lamplight trembled as if listening. "What becomes of these?" the king asked at last, his voice thin but steady. "When there is no one left who remembers the cases behind them?" The clerk, surprised by the question, blinked and looked around as if to search for an answer among his shelves. "They remain, sire," he said slowly, "for those who come after, so they may see how things were judged in your time. They may copy or change or ignore, but the records remain." The king absorbed this with the same quiet with which he now received all news. That was the best any life could hope for in that room, to be consulted, compared, and more often than not, set aside in the face of new circumstances. There was a certain mercy in that too. When he left the chamber for the last time, he felt not the weight of his past verdicts upon him, but their distance. They were no longer tools in his hand. They had become part of the stone, part of the stratified memory upon which others would someday walk without knowing exactly what lay beneath their feet. Winter came. It arrived first as a taste in the air, metallic, sharp, then as frost in the mornings, whitening the edges of the battlements and turning puddles in the courtyard into panes of fragile glass that shattered under careless steps. The sea grew darker, its surface roughened more often by wind. Storms rolled in with less patience, their clouds stacking on the horizon like heavy thoughts. The king's world narrowed to the room, the window, the bed. There were days when he could no longer make the journey to the chair unassisted. On those days, he lay with his head angled to see even a sliver of sky, taking comfort not in the view itself, but in the knowledge that it existed just beyond stone and air. Voices came and went around him, priests with their practiced reassurances, family members with their carefully chosen concern, attendants whose hands had learned the new choreography of helping him sit, turn, drink. They spoke to him, and he replied when he could, but more and more, words seemed to be a currency that did not buy much. In quieter hours, he listened inward, tracing the paths of his own fading strength. The body that had once bore armor and cold and long days in the saddle now negotiated with each breath, each shift. There was a certain humbling in this, but no real surprise. Kings had always shared this ending with everyone else. He did not ask, in those last days, for the drafts of the proposed code. He knew they existed, somewhere in the hands of eager men, half-formed, waiting. He chose not to summon them, not to read the articles that would have borne his initial had he given it. It was not an avoidance born of fear, but a decision to let the absent stand unfilled. The kingdom would say, in years to come, that he had left certain matters unresolved. It would be true. On a day when snow threatened but did not yet fall, the sea was a vast, heaving dark, its whitecaps torn into thin lines by a wind that keened through the window with a more insistent voice than usual. The king lay on his bed, propped slightly, the chair by the window empty for the first time in many months. Those who attended him knew what such days meant. Their movements became softer, more reverent, as if they feared startling whatever was drawing closer. Prayers were said, not loudly, but with the steady rhythm of old habit. Someone sprinkled blessed water on the stone near the door, as if sanctifying the threshold could influence which way the soul would walk. He drifted in and out of a shallow, flickering sleep. In the moments of clarity, he did not see visions of battles or coronations. He saw, instead, the parchment on the table, the ink spot near its edge, the way light had moved away from the page when he slid it aside. He saw the horizon again and again, a line that was never truly straight, always dancing as the sea breathed beneath it. If there were regrets, they did not come in the form of pleas for undoing. They came more like acknowledgments. Yes, that was harsh. Yes, that was necessary. Yes, that was neither and both. His life, viewed from this angle, looked less like a line and more like a shore, eroded in places, built up in others, impossible to summarize with a single word. When the end came, it did so as quietly as everything else had grown to be. There was no final proclamation, no carefully arranged last words to be recorded and repeated. His chest rose, fell, rose again, then, at last, did not. A servant, noticing the change, went to inform those whose duty it was to be present at such moments. The priest came, murmured the proper prayers, traced the proper signs. A son or two stood near, their faces caught between grief and the sharp private awareness that the shape of their own days had just altered irrevocably. Outside, the sea struck the cliff with the same indifferent force as it had the day before. Messengers were dispatched. Bells were rung, their sound pealing out over roofs and fields, telling the kingdom what it already half knew. The rain had ended. Within hours, heralds would begin to speak of the late king in the past tense. Scribes would take up their quills to begin the work of turning a life into paragraphs. In the days that followed, men searched the rooms of authority for evidence of his final intentions. Among other things, they looked for a definitive text, a body of law that could be held up and proclaimed as his last gift to the realm. They found decrees, of course, petitions granted, disputes settled in the months before his strength failed, but no code, no binding, no great work of articles. The drafts that had been prepared by anxious counselors lay like scaffolding without a building, detailed and useless. Some muttered that he had been indecisive at the end. Others, less charitable, said he had been too tired, too clouded of mind to finish what he had begun. A few, remembering his long hours by the window, suggested he had simply turned away, preferring contemplation to completion. The record will not say why. The record never does. Along the coast, in the villages where the waves wrote their own schedule, life adjusted with the slower, deeper logic it always used. Nets were mended, boats caulked, fields plowed when weather permitted. The news of the king's death arrived on market days, carried by travelers who also brought spices, rumors, new songs. People listened, crossed themselves, or nodded according to their custom, and then returned to the price of grain, the illness of a child, the question of whether the winter would be mild or cruel. For them, the absence of a new code was less important than the presence or absence of mercy in the local magistrate, of patience in the tax collector, of decency in the petty nobles who controlled permission and access. The law, in their daily lives, was a face and a hand, not a book. The sea remained. It went on eroding the cliff in discrete increments, carrying away small fragments of the rock upon which the castle stood. None of these collapses were dramatic. There were no great falls of stone into the water, no sudden crumbling of towers. Instead, there were tiny shifts, flakes and pebbles, and occasional slabs giving way in storms, unremarked except by the gulls who temporarily lost a favorite perch. If any god watched the work, it did so without commentary. Years later, bards would sing of the old king according to the needs of their audiences. Some would praise his firmness, recalling battles and treaties. Others would dwell on his supposed hesitations, using him as a cautionary example against weakness in those who rule. A few, whose craft leaned more toward nuance, would mention his long vigils by the sea, hinting at a contemplative nature that did not fit easily into simple tales. None of them would speak of the unwritten law, because it is hard to make a story out of something that did not happen. And yet, somewhere beneath the official memory and the songs, a quieter understanding persisted, not as words, but as texture, in periods when justice remained a little less rigid than it might have been, when judges allowed themselves to see the person before them, and not only the offense, when rulers hesitated before signing orders that would bruise more than they protected. There was, perhaps, the faint echo of a decision once made in a small, bare room. The castle aged. New banners hung where old ones had faded. Portraits of new kings joined the gallery, their painted eyes carrying their own forms of certainty. The window above the sea continued to admit light and wind and the sound of waves, regardless of who sat beside it. On some mornings, when the tide was low and the dawn thin, one could stand on the shore far below and look up to see the castle's outline against the sky, a jagged, stubborn mark upon the cliff. From that angle, it was possible to imagine that the stone itself remembered all who had lived and decided above it, not as names or dates, but as the faint, lingering warmth of footprints long since washed away. The sea rose, fell, rose again, and in the endless patience of that rhythm, there remained a small, unrecorded mercy that there had once been a king who at the end of his long, imperfect reign chose to leave one page blank rather than carve another wound into the world with his pen.